When it comes to David's story with Bathsheba, I've always wondered how David allowed himself to get into a position where one, he was lost in after someone, and two, he made the decision to kill her husband when he discovered she was pregnant for him. So David and Bathsheba's story. Well, as I have been journeying through Second Samuel, I think I came upon it. So in Second Samuel 10, we see David's story with the Ammonites, who he'd had a deal with them, and then the king he had a deal with that, and then the king's son, took over from his father. But then the king's son decided he didn't really care much for the relationship between Israel and the Ammonites that his father had had with David. And there was a whole thing in Second Samuel 10. But at the end of it, David and his army soundly conquered not just the Ammonites, but everyone that came out to help fight for them. So the Arameans and whatever nations came out to help with the Ammonites, they were soundly defeated. And Second Samuel 10, the last verse, tells us when all the kings allied with Hadadezer, who was the new king of the Ammonites, saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they surrendered to Israel and became their subjects. After that, the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites. So essentially, the Ammonites had no one to help them in their fight against Israel. And then Second Samuel 11 is the chapter that tells us about David and Bathsheba's story. Verse 1 tells, the first half of verse 1 tells us, in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. And right there, in 2 Samuel 11:1 tells us the reason why David found himself in a vulnerable position. After a string of victories, he became complacent to the extent where when kings normally go out to war, David decided, well, the Ammonites have no one to call on them. He'd had a string of victories, killing, defeating his enemies left, right, and center. Even 2 Samuel 9 tells us about victories he had. So all around him, he had been having victories and defeating his enemies. So that in the time when kings would normally go out to war, he decided, well, I'm just going to chill out at the house while his army went to fight. And when he should have been fighting, he was taking a leisurely stroll on the roof of his palace, and that's how he noticed a woman taking a bath from the roof of his house. I've got a lot of questions about all of that, but I don't want to get distracted. For example, why was Bathsheba taking a bath outside? Is that how the architecture was back then? But we'll put that at the side for a minute. I was thinking about how that relates. What happened to David happens to all of us. In a season of need, we pray to God. We are so diligent with our relationship with God. And once we start to see, do I want to call it some victory, small victories, a string of good things start to happen, prayers start to be answered, we get complacent. Our relationship with God kind of cools off. We're not praying as fervently. We're not reading the word as much as we should. Even our attitude towards church going might cool off a little bit. We find more and more excuses on why we should not get up early in the morning or late at night to pray. We find more excuses why we are missing church services. All of a sudden, where we would give up a lot of things to make sure we're in the house of God. We choose those things or other events. Um, yeah, it happens to us. When I say us, I'm including myself in it. I'm not exempt. But in that state of complacency is where we get into trouble. First of all, we're no longer fortifying ourselves with prayer. We're no longer building a relationship with God, and we just open ourselves up for the enemy to sneak in and do something and mess with us, because we become complacent because a string of good things have happened. And that was how David got into trouble. If he had been where he was supposed to be, out fighting a war, just like the other kings, he wouldn't have found himself in a position to notice Bathsheba taking her bath and then just making a string of bad decision after bad decision. The entirety of 2 Samuel 11, from very young, like David's story with Bathsheba, has always made me upset, and only because of the way Uriah got treated. Uriah, who was so loyal to his king that he would not go home to sleep, so loyal to his brothers in the army that he would not go back home to sleep because they're out there fighting. Why should he be the only one who gets to go home and for a few days? First of all, I mean, David's a reaction to finding out Bathsheba was pregnant. The first thing was to try and cover it up, but in doing so, he failed to recognize loyalty. David, who was so upset with Joab, found a loyal soldier that he just sped past that, and the next thing was, well, let's kill him. Because if this soldier suddenly found out his wife was pregnant and he knows he hasn't been home for a while and so on and so forth, all of it was just to cover up what he had done, and he made bad decision after bad decision, leading to something as horrible as arranging the death of a man. Even the way Uriah's death was reported to him, a battle report was sent to him, and if you notice, Joab was, from verse 18 of the same 2 Samuel 11, sent the battle report to David, and he, in the way he couched it, he was thinking, well, David would be upset that they lost some people, and he even told the messenger, well, if the king becomes upset and asks about this, tell him this. But then the messenger gets to David and tells him, well, people died, some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite, and David's response was, well, tell Joab not to be discouraged. The sword kills one person today and the other one tomorrow. Fight that the next time. And just he kind of brushed it off because Uriah had died. But it all started with David being complacent. He'd won so many battles and now life is good. Enemies are being conquered. I don't really need to be there. So that when kings normally go to war, he decided to stay back. And so I guess my question for us is, when we assess our relationship with God, have we become complacent? Is it no longer that important to pray? It's no longer that important to read the word. And it's so easy to make excuses about going to church, being in the presence of God, developing our relationship with God, waiting to hear from Him, because things we've prayed for have started to manifest in our lives. Other than that being such a horrible way to conduct a relationship, because if it was a human relationship and every time you wanted something from me, you're so close to me, you're talking to me all the time, we're building each other up, we're hanging out, and then once you get what you want, you disappear. And when you want something, you come back. For a human relationship, that happens maybe 2-3 times and the relationship is done. So we thank God for mercy. But that is a horrible way to conduct a relationship. Number one. And number two, in addition to it being a horrible way to conduct a relationship, it leaves us very open, wide open for the enemy to mess with us. So let's get better. That's my understanding of what happened with David, and I see how it definitely happens in our lives today. So let's get better about maintaining our relationship with God, no matter what season we find ourselves in. I would say when things have started to go well, because of the human tendency to relax, that is the time to amp up our efforts so that the enemy has no room to come in and tempt us. He's always tempting us, but we are more susceptible to falling for temptation when we're no longer in tune with God as we used to be. So let's keep an eye out for that. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think.